The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Benning rifle range as Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson watched the newest batch of recruits fumble with their weapons. At 52, Marcus had seen enough young soldiers to know that most of them thought they knew everything about shooting after playing video games and hunting with their fathers. Today would be different. Today, the old-timer would teach them a lesson they would never forget. Marcus had been instructing marksmanship for over 15 years, but he still remembered his own first day at boot camp 30 years ago. Back then, he was just another cocky 18-year-old from rural Montana who thought his experience hunting deer made him an expert marksman. The Army had quickly humbled him, and now it was his turn to pass along that humility to the next generation. The 24 recruits stood in formation, their brand-new M4 carbines gleaming in the sunlight. Each weapon had been meticulously maintained by the armory staff, zeroed to perfection, and inspected multiple times. These young men and women had spent weeks learning the fundamentals of marksmanship in classroom settings, memorizing breathing techniques, sight alignment, and trigger control. They had practiced dry firing until their fingers ached and studied ballistics charts until the numbers swam before their eyes. "Listen up," Marcus barked, his voice carrying the authority earned through 3 combat deployments and countless hours on ranges around the world. "Today you'll demonstrate everything you've learned about marksmanship. You'll be shooting at targets placed at 100, 200, and 300 meters. Each of you will fire 40 rounds, and your scores will determine your marksman qualification level." Private Johnson, a lanky kid from Texas who had been bragging about his high school shooting team achievements, raised his hand. "Sergeant, will you be shooting with us today?" Marcus smiled, an expression that made several recruits shift nervously. They had learned that when Sergeant Thompson smiled like that, something interesting was about to happen. "As a matter of fact, I will be. But there's a catch." He paused, letting the suspense build. "I'll be using whatever rifle is left over after you all select yours." The recruits exchanged glances. This seemed like an easy win for them. They would get first pick of the weapons, ensuring they had the best maintained rifles, while their instructor would be stuck with whatever remained. Some of them had already spotted the rifle they wanted, the ones that looked the newest or had the cleanest barrels. What Marcus didn't tell them was that he had noticed something the day before during his routine inspection of the weapons. Rifle number 47, sitting at the far end of the rack, had a problem that would have sent any other instructor scrambling to the armorer. The front sight post was bent, clearly damaged during the previous day's training, when a careless recruit had dropped the weapon. The rear sight was also slightly loose, wobbling when touched. Most concerning of all, the barrel showed signs of throat erosion, indicating it had been fired extensively without proper maintenance. Marcus had deliberately left this rifle in the rack, knowing that by the laws of Murphy, it would be the one he ended up with. He could have easily had it removed and replaced, but that wouldn't serve his purpose. He wanted to demonstrate something important to these young soldiers, something that couldn't be taught from a textbook or learned in a classroom. As the recruits began selecting their weapons, Marcus watched them carefully examine each rifle, looking for signs of wear, checking the smoothness of the bolt action, and peering down barrels to assess their condition. They were applying everything they had learned about weapons maintenance, trying to give themselves every possible advantage. Private Martinez, a sharp young woman from California, spent several minutes comparing 2 rifles before making her selection. Corporal Kim, who had prior service in the National Guard, showed the newer recruits how to properly inspect a weapon before choosing. Within minutes, 23 rifles had been claimed, leaving Marcus with the damaged weapon number 47. As he picked it up, he immediately felt the loose rear sight. A quick glance down the barrel confirmed what he already knew. This rifle would be lucky to hit a target at 50 meters, let alone the 300-meter targets they would be engaging. "Sergeant," called out Private Williams, a former college athlete who had been questioning many of Marcus's training methods. "Are you sure you want to use that one? It looks pretty beat up." Marcus hefted the rifle, feeling its familiar weight, despite its obvious defects. "This old girl and I will do just fine," he replied, his voice calm and confident. "Besides, it's not always about having the perfect equipment. Sometimes it's about the soldier behind the weapon." The recruits lined up at the firing line, their rifles resting on sandbags, muzzles pointed downrange toward the targets. Marcus took his position at the far right end of the line, rifle number 47 looking shabby compared to the pristine weapons surrounding it. As he settled into his shooting position, he could feel several sets of eyes watching him skeptically. The first phase of shooting would be at 100-meter targets, prone position, 20 rounds. This was considered the easiest portion of the qualification, where most recruits could achieve decent scores even with minimal experience. Marcus watched as his students adjusted their sights, checked their positions, and prepared for the command to commence firing. "Shooters, you may commence firing when ready," came the command from the tower. The range erupted in the sharp crack of rifle fire as 24 recruits began engaging their targets. Marcus remained motionless, studying the damaged rifle in his hands. He had noticed that the bent front sight post was canted about 15 degrees to the right, which would cause his shots to impact significantly left of his point of aim. The loose rear sight would create additional inconsistency, making precision nearly impossible under normal circumstances. But Marcus wasn't planning to shoot under normal circumstances. He was going to compensate for every defect in this weapon using techniques he had learned through decades of experience. He had fired expert marksman scores with damaged weapons in Afghanistan, had made precision shots in Iraq with rifles that had been through sandstorms and firefights, and had qualified with weapons that other soldiers had declared unusable. As the recruits continued firing, some struggling with their positions, others fighting recoil and flinching, Marcus finally raised his rifle. To the untrained eye, his position looked identical to the textbook-prone shooting stance they had all learned. But Marcus had made subtle adjustments, compensating for the weapon's defects in ways that would be invisible to observers. His breathing was controlled and rhythmic, each shot timed to the natural respiratory pause. His trigger finger moved straight back, applying steady pressure despite the rifle's worn trigger mechanism. Most importantly, his mental calculations accounted for the sight misalignment, adjusting his point of aim to compensate for the inevitable deviation. The first shot rang out, and Marcus immediately knew it had found its mark. The second followed smoothly, then the third. While recruits around him were still struggling to find consistent impact points, Marcus was systematically placing rounds exactly where he intended them to go, despite using a weapon that should have been turned in for repair. By the time he fired his 20th round at the 100-meter target, Marcus had achieved something that would have been considered impossible by anyone who had examined his rifle. Every shot had landed in the center scoring ring, many touching or overlapping previous hits. The recruits who had finished their strings were using spotting scopes to check their targets, calling out scores to each other and comparing their results. Most were achieving scores in the 160-170 range out of a possible 200 points for this phase, which was considered acceptable for new shooters. When the range officer announced that Sergeant Thompson had scored a perfect 200 out of 200 at the 100-meter line, a murmur of surprise rippled through the group. Several recruits looked at his damaged rifle with new confusion, unable to understand how such a worn weapon could produce such results. Private Johnson, the Texan who had been so confident earlier, lowered his spotting scope and stared at Marcus with undisguised amazement. "Sergeant, how did you do that with that busted rifle?" Marcus simply smiled and began preparing for the 200-meter phase of the qualification. "The weapon is just a tool," he replied quietly. "It's the soldier who makes the difference." The lesson was beginning to sink in, but Marcus knew the most challenging parts were still ahead. As they prepared to move to the 200-meter targets, the recruits found themselves looking at their instructor with new respect and curiosity. They had assumed that having the best equipment would give them an insurmountable advantage. But Marcus had just demonstrated that skill and experience could overcome mechanical disadvantages in ways they had never imagined possible. The 200-meter line presented new challenges for everyone involved. At this distance, the effects of wind became more pronounced, breathing technique became crucial, and the margin for error decreased significantly. For Marcus, shooting with the damaged rifle, these factors would be magnified tenfold. The bent sight post that caused minor deviations at 100 meters would create much larger point-of-impact shifts at 200 meters. As the recruits settled into their new firing positions, Marcus could see their confidence beginning to waver. The targets looked noticeably smaller at this distance, and several of the younger soldiers were squinting through their sights, struggling to maintain proper sight picture. Private Chen, who had scored well at the previous distance, was now fidgeting with her rifle adjustments, second-guessing the settings that had worked perfectly just minutes earlier. Marcus took his position and immediately felt a light breeze coming from his left. This crosswind would push bullets to the right, but with his damaged front sight already causing shots to drift left, the wind might actually help compensate for some of the mechanical problems. It was a delicate balance that would require careful calculation and years of experience to navigate successfully. 200-meter targets, 20 rounds, you may commence firing when ready, announced the range control officer. This time, several recruits began firing almost immediately, eager to get their shots off before the wind conditions changed. Marcus watched them through his peripheral vision, noting their rushed approach and predicting the struggles they would face. Patience had been one of the hardest lessons for him to learn as a young soldier, and he could see these recruits making the same mistakes he had made decades earlier. Private Williams, the former athlete who had questioned Marcus earlier, was firing rapidly, apparently trying to group his shots before his position shifted. But Marcus could see that his breathing was erratic, and his trigger pulls were becoming increasingly jerky as frustration mounted. The young man's shots were scattering across the target face, with several missing the scoring rings entirely. Marcus waited, observing the wind patterns and feeling the subtle changes in air movement across his face. A seasoned marksman learns to read these conditions like a meteorologist reads weather patterns. The flags downrange were providing information about wind direction and speed, but the true test was feeling how these conditions would affect bullet trajectory over the longer distance. When Marcus finally began his shooting sequence, each shot was deliberate and methodical. He had learned long ago that rushed shots almost always resulted in missed targets, while patient, well-aimed shots consistently found their mark. His first round at 200 meters was a calculated risk, aimed to test his compensation calculations for the rifle's defects at the increased distance. The shot felt good as it left the barrel, and Marcus was fairly certain it had found the center ring. His follow-up shots built upon this initial success, each one refining his understanding of how the damaged weapon behaved at this new distance. What appeared to be impossible to the casual observer was actually the result of systematic problem-solving and decades of accumulated knowledge. By his 10th shot, Marcus had established a consistent pattern. Each round was landing in nearly the same place, creating a tight group that would be impressive for any shooter, let alone someone using a rifle that should have been condemned for training use. The recruits who had finished their strings early were now watching Marcus with undisguised amazement. Private Martinez, who had scored respectably at 100 meters, was struggling significantly at the longer distance. Her shots were scattered across the target, and Marcus could see her confidence crumbling with each poor result. She was making the classic mistake of over-adjusting her sights after each shot, chasing previous impacts instead of maintaining consistent fundamentals. "Sergeant," she called out during a ceasefire, I was doing fine at the closer distance, but I can't seem to hit anything now. What am I doing wrong? Marcus finished his string, once again achieving a perfect score, before addressing her question. Martinez, what's different between 100 and 200 meters besides the distance? She thought for a moment, then replied uncertainly, The target looks smaller? That's part of it, Marcus acknowledged. But think about what else has changed. What about your position, your breathing, your sight picture? As Marcus guided Martinez through a mental checklist of marksmanship fundamentals, several other recruits gathered around to listen. They were beginning to understand that their instructor's success wasn't just luck or some mysterious talent they couldn't comprehend. It was the application of systematic knowledge and disciplined technique. The biggest mistake most new shooters make at longer distances, Marcus explained, is changing everything that worked for them at shorter ranges. They start overthinking, over-adjusting, and overcompensating. The fundamentals don't change, whether you're shooting at 25 meters or 500 meters. Private Johnson, who had been boastful earlier but was now shooting poorly, looked frustrated and embarrassed. But Sergeant, your rifle is obviously damaged, and you're still out shooting all of us with our perfect weapons. How is that even possible? Marcus picked up rifle number 47 and showed the group its obvious defects. The bent sight post was clearly visible, and he demonstrated how the rear sight wobbled when touched. This rifle has multiple problems that should make accurate shooting nearly impossible, he admitted, but I've learned to work with equipment limitations rather than being defeated by them. He explained how he had calculated sight compensation, adjusted his point of aim to account for the mechanical defects, and used environmental factors like wind to help correct for some of the weapon's problems. What seemed like magic to the recruits was actually applied mathematics, physics, and environmental awareness. In combat, Marcus continued, you don't always have perfect equipment. Your rifle might be dirty, damaged, or hastily zeroed. The soldier who can only shoot well with perfect conditions and perfect equipment is a liability to his unit. The soldier who can adapt and overcome equipment problems is an asset. As they prepared for the final phase of qualification at 300 meters, the recruits found themselves looking at both their weapons and their instructor with new understanding. The lesson wasn't just about marksmanship, it was about adaptability, problem-solving, and the difference between technical knowledge and practical application. Private Kim, who had prior National Guard experience, nodded thoughtfully. So you're saying that all our classroom learning about perfect conditions and textbook technique is just the starting point? Exactly, Marcus replied. The classroom gives you the foundation, but real-world application requires flexibility and adaptation. Anyone can shoot well when everything is perfect. The true test of a marksman is what happens when nothing goes according to plan. The wind was picking up as they moved to the 300-meter firing line, and storm clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon. The final phase of their qualification was going to test everyone's skills under increasingly challenging conditions, and Marcus's damaged rifle would face its ultimate trial at the longest distance they would engage. The 300-meter line was where marksmanship qualifications separated the adequate shooters from the truly skilled ones. At this distance, every small error in technique was magnified dramatically, and environmental factors that seemed minor at closer ranges became major obstacles to accuracy. The approaching storm system had brought gusty, shifting winds that were making the range flags dance erratically, creating conditions that would challenge even experienced marksmen. Marcus watched as his recruits settled into their positions with obvious nervousness. Several of them were already making excuses about the weather conditions, anticipating poor performance, and preparing explanations for their expected failures. This attitude frustrated Marcus more than their technical mistakes, because it revealed a mindset that would limit their potential throughout their military careers. Private Chen was visibly shaking as she tried to establish a stable shooting position. The combination of distance, wind, and mounting pressure had overwhelmed her confidence completely. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, making steady aim impossible, and her grip on the rifle was so tight that her knuckles had turned white. Marcus could see that she was psyching herself out before firing a single shot. At the other end of the emotional spectrum, Private Williams had adopted an attitude of resignation and blame. He was loudly complaining about the wind conditions, the quality of the ammunition, and the difficulty of the targets, essentially preparing everyone around him for his poor performance. This defeatist attitude was infectious, and Marcus could see it spreading to other recruits who had been maintaining positive attitudes. "Listen up," Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the complaints and nervous chatter. "I want everyone to stop what they're doing and look downrange at those targets." The recruits complied, squinting at the distant black silhouettes that seemed impossibly small against the hillside backdrop. "Those targets are exactly the same size they were when we started today. The distance hasn't changed, and your rifles haven't gotten any less accurate since we began. The only thing that's different is what's happening inside your heads." Marcus paused, letting this sink in. "You're defeating yourselves before you even try." Marcus positioned himself with rifle number 47, its defects now even more pronounced in the challenging conditions. The bent sight post would create maximum deviation at this distance. The loose rear sight would make consistency nearly impossible, and the worn barrel would struggle to maintain accuracy over the longer trajectory. Add in the unpredictable wind patterns, and most experienced marksmen would have declared the task impossible. But Marcus had faced impossible shots before, in places where failure meant more than a poor qualification score. In Afghanistan, he had made precision shots with damaged weapons while under enemy fire, where there was no time for perfect conditions or equipment adjustments. In Iraq, he had engaged targets at extreme distances with rifles that had been through sandstorms and firefights, where adaptation wasn't just preferred, it was essential for survival. "Watch and learn," Marcus announced as he settled into his shooting position. "I'm going to show you what's possible when you stop making excuses and start solving problems." The wind gusted as Marcus raised his rifle, causing several range flags to snap wildly. Most of the recruits would have waited for calmer conditions, but Marcus had learned long ago that perfect conditions rarely exist when you need them most. Instead of waiting, he began reading the wind patterns, noting the different speeds and directions at various points along the bullet's flight path. His first shot at 300 meters was a calculated experiment, designed to test his compensation calculations at the extreme distance. Marcus had adjusted his point of aim significantly to account for the bent sight post, estimated the wind drift, and compensated for the rifle's mechanical problems. When the shot broke, he felt confident it would find the target, though he couldn't be certain exactly where. The subsequent shots built upon this initial data point, with Marcus making subtle adjustments based on his observations of bullet impact. What looked like casual shooting to the untrained eye was actually a complex process of environmental reading, mathematical calculation, and mechanical compensation happening in real time. By his 10th shot, Marcus had once again established a consistent group despite the challenging conditions and damaged equipment. The recruits watched in stunned silence as their instructor systematically placed rounds into the center scoring ring with a rifle they had written off as unusable. Private Martinez, who had been struggling with her confidence, raised her hand tentatively. "Sergeant Thompson, how do you make it look so easy? You're using a broken rifle in terrible conditions, but you're shooting better than all of us with perfect equipment." Marcus completed his 20th and final shot before answering. When the range officer announced another perfect score of 200 out of 200, the silence that followed was profound. 24 recruits with pristine weapons and ideal preparation had been consistently outshot by their instructor using equipment that should have made accurate shooting impossible. "The difference," Marcus began, setting down rifle number 47, "isn't in the equipment or the conditions. It's in the approach. You've been taught to shoot under perfect circumstances with perfect equipment. But that's not how the real world works. He gestured toward the recruits' weapons. "You spent all your time selecting the best rifles, checking every detail, making sure everything was perfect before you started. That's good preparation, but it also created a dependency on perfect conditions. When things weren't perfect anymore, you didn't know how to adapt." Private Johnson, who had been humbled by his poor performance throughout the day, asked quietly, "So what should we have been focusing on instead?" "Fundamentals," Marcus replied immediately. "Breathing, sight picture, trigger control, natural point of aim, position stability. These things work regardless of equipment condition or environmental factors. When you master the fundamentals so completely that they become automatic, you can adapt to any situation." Marcus picked up the damaged rifle and demonstrated his shooting position, showing how he had modified his stance slightly to compensate for the weapon's defects. "I didn't try to fix this rifle's problems. I worked around them. I used the wind instead of fighting it. I adjusted my expectations and techniques to match the conditions I faced, rather than hoping conditions would match my preferred techniques." The storm clouds were now directly overhead, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. As the recruits gathered their equipment and prepared to return to the barracks, Marcus could see that something fundamental had changed in their attitudes. The cocky confidence had been replaced by thoughtful consideration, and the complaint-filled excuses had been replaced by questions about improvement. Private Williams, who had been the most vocal critic earlier, approached Marcus as they walked back from the range. "Sergeant, I've been thinking about what you said regarding adapting instead of complaining. Could you teach us how to shoot with less than perfect equipment? I mean, really teach us, not just tell us it's possible." Marcus smiled, recognizing the transformation that had occurred. "Williams, that's exactly what we've been doing all day. The lesson wasn't about me showing off with a broken rifle. It was about showing you that limitations only exist if you accept them as permanent obstacles instead of temporary challenges to overcome." As they reached the armory, Marcus carefully cleaned rifle number 47 and prepared it for turn-in to maintenance. The weapon had served its purpose admirably, teaching a lesson that no amount of classroom instruction could have provided. Tomorrow, these recruits would begin advanced training with a completely different mindset about the relationship between equipment, conditions, and performance. Private Chen, who had struggled so badly with nerves, stopped at the armory door. "Sergeant Thompson, I realized something today. I was so worried about failing that I forgot everything I had learned about actually shooting. Will you teach us how to stay focused under pressure?" Marcus nodded approvingly. "Chen, that's the most important question anyone has asked today. Mental discipline is the foundation of everything else. Perfect equipment can't help a shooter who defeats himself mentally, but strong mental discipline can overcome almost any mechanical obstacle." The rain was falling steadily now as the recruits filed into the armory, each carrying not just their weapons, but a fundamentally changed understanding of what it meant to be a marksman. They had witnessed something that challenged their assumptions about the importance of perfect conditions and equipment, and many of them were already beginning to think differently about their approach to training and problem-solving. Marcus remained outside for a moment, watching the rain fall on the empty range where he had just delivered one of the most important lessons of his teaching career. The damaged rifle had done its job perfectly, proving that the most valuable equipment any soldier could carry was the knowledge, adaptability, and mental toughness developed through experience and proper training. The recruits would remember this day for the rest of their military careers, not because their instructor had demonstrated superior marksmanship skills, but because he had shown them that excellence wasn't dependent on perfect circumstances. They had learned that the difference between adequate soldiers and exceptional ones wasn't found in their equipment or conditions, but in their ability to adapt, overcome, and perform regardless of obstacles. As Marcus finally headed inside, he was already planning tomorrow's training, knowing that his recruits would approach it with the kind of open minds and determined attitudes that would serve them well throughout their military service and beyond.